Welcome to Grade 8 History, Unit Number 1, Creating Canada, 1850 to 1890. This is Lesson Number 1, What Shaped the Atlantic Colonies? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. When we think of the Maritimes today, what images come to our minds? How is life in the Atlantic provinces different from life in Ontario, and why? Now, just to refresh everybody's memory, when we talk about the Maritimes or the Atlantic provinces, we are referring to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. Now, what I want you to do is to put the video on pause when I tell you to, so that you can write down your responses to these two questions, which we'll talk about further tomorrow. So put the video on pause now. All right, let's begin. In 1850, British North America was made up of separate colonies and territories. The colonies were controlled by the British government, and the territories were governed by the Hudson's Bay Company. The Atlantic colonies were Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The colonies further inland were Canada West and Canada East. The Northwest region and New Caledonia were the territories controlled by the HBC. All of these colonies and territories were established on First Nations lands, which forced the displacement or relocation of the native peoples. So here's a map showing you what British North America looked like in 1850. And here's a question for you to consider. How do you think the distances between the colonies and territories affected their relations with each other? So what I mean is, how easy or difficult do you think it was for a person or a group in Newfoundland to communicate with those living in the Northwest Territories? How easy or how difficult do you think it was for someone in Canada East to do business with someone in New Caledonia? Put the video on pause so that you can write down your response to this question in blue, and we'll talk about it some more in tomorrow's class. All right, moving on. Although they were physically close to each other, the Atlantic colonies were very different from each other. For example, Newfoundland was known for its fisheries, while PEI was known for agriculture. Nova Scotia was known for its coal mines and shipping. For New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, forestry and shipbuilding were key parts of the economy. Ships built in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia carried goods throughout the world. What you're going to do when I finish talking is you're going to put this video on pause so that you can get a closer look at this image. And as you're taking that closer look at this image, I want you to write down your response to this question. What details in this image show that shipbuilding was a successful industry in New Brunswick? So please put the video on pause now. And moving on. Industry was booming in the Atlantic colonies in the mid-1800s. There were many opportunities for middle-class and working-class people to make a living. Most struggled to get by, however merchants, shipbuilders, and other business people were able to develop successful businesses, which resulted in the birth of a wealthy upper class. Ports in the Atlantic colonies were bustling with activity in the 1850s. In New Brunswick, industries such as lumber, iron, and coal benefited from the shipbuilding industry. We'll just draw your attention to this image here. In 1990, this monument of successful New Brunswick businessman Joseph Salter was built to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Moncton's incorporation as a city. Why do you think there's a monument for Salter and not for the people who worked for Salter and helped to make Moncton a proud city? And yes, we'll talk about this some more tomorrow. So good idea for you to put the video on pause now and write down your response to this question. Now let's continue. The mid-1800s were also an uncertain time for some people living in the Atlantic colonies. While PEI had good agricultural resources, only 1/3 of the farmers on the island owned the land they worked on. The other 2/3 were tenants who had to pay rent to landlords. Violent conflict sometimes broke out when landlords tried to remove farmers who fell behind in paying their rent. To make a living in Newfoundland, people braved the rough waters of the North Atlantic. Fishing families were often in debt to wealthy merchants. The merchants controlled the fishing industry by buying the catch and supplying fishing families with food and equipment. Take a look at this image on the left. Here's a question for you. Why do you think the Marco Polo's owners commissioned a painting of the ship sailing on rough waters? Well, you put the video on pause so you can get a closer look at this image, and then you can write down your response to this question in blue. Okay, let's continue. During the first half of the 1800s, most of the goods produced by the Atlantic colonies were traded to Britain, the United States, the West Indies, and Latin America. Few goods were traded to the other British North American colonies. This would change over time due to economic development and political change in Britain and the US. The boom in railway building in the US in the 1850s led to greater demand for agricultural goods. In 1854, Britain and the US signed the Reciprocity Treaty, which allowed free trade, that's trade without taxes, between British North America and the US. Trade with the US increased steadily. However, in 1861, the American Civil War broke out. While the war created more demand for agricultural goods from the Atlantic colonies, the U.S. ended the Reciprocity Treaty in 1865, the year that the Civil War ended. The Americans began heavily taxing goods from British North America, and the Atlantic colonies lost a valuable trade partner. Unless it came from a wealthy family, most children in the 1800s had to help their families make a living. In the 1800s, children's work was much harder and much more dangerous than children's work today. As British North America became more industrialized, more children spent their days working in factories under brutal conditions, and we'll be looking at this a lot more closely as the semester progresses, especially in our second unit in grade 8 history. Children often did the same work as adults, but for much less pay. They would work on farms and in mills, factories, and mines. Children in British North America were not protected by child labor laws that existed in Britain. Children as young as 7 or 8 were sent to work. By 1866, there were 449 boys working in coal mines in Nova Scotia. In New Brunswick, girls as young as 10 were cleaning and preparing the catch for fish merchants. Children worked in addition to their home chores, such as looking after younger siblings and cooking. In the Atlantic colonies, the First Nations had signed peace and friendship treaties with the British government. These treaties guaranteed native rights to fish throughout the region and to maintain a reasonable livelihood. However, the British government did little to protect the small territories reserved for the First Nations. The colonists who established industries built on what was once First Nations land rarely offered jobs to First Nations peoples. The influx of European immigrants and the rise of industries forced the First Nations to find different ways to earn a living. They used their skills to harvest maple syrup, berries, and other wild produce. They also made baskets, brooms, and barrels to sell. One final image for you to look at here. What examples can you see of the Maliseet people incorporating European customs into their lives? So one final time, please put the video on pause so you can get a closer look at this image and then write your response to the question in blue. All right, time for the wrap up. So let's finish today's lesson by considering the following, and we'll discuss this in tomorrow's class. Two questions. Number one, why was the Reciprocity Treaty significant or important for the Atlantic colonies? And two, how did the development of trade and industry affect the lives of First Nations people living in the Atlantic colonies of British North America? So what you should do is put this video on pause now so that the questions stay on your screen and you can write down your responses. All right, I look forward to hearing everybody's responses to these two questions as well as the other questions that were given throughout the course of this video. But until we meet tomorrow, this concludes today's video.